Chinese Premier Xi Jinping won't be attending the G20 Summit in New Delhi on September 9th and 10th. According to the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Chinese Premier Li Qiang will be attending the gathering. Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden has expressed regret over Xi Jinping's decision to skip the meet. Now, Xi Jinping is the second leader to give the G20 event in New Delhi a miss. Earlier, President Vladimir Putin has already conveyed to Prime Minister Narendra Modi that it will not be possible for him to travel to India to participate in the summit. Well, for more on this, we are now being joined by principal diplomatic correspondent Siddhant Sibbal, live from New Delhi. Siddhant, if you can hear me, my first question to you. Xi Jinping now perhaps skipping the G20 summit. How is the diplomatic community reading this?
Well, there are several aspects to it. First, of course, the domestic aspect. We know that the situation, the economic situation in China is something that has been making global headlines. The second, of course, is India-China relationship. It hasn't been doing very well. We know that while the Chinese President Xi Jinping was in South Africa, in Johannesburg, he's skipping the Delhi summit. And the announcement that has come short while ago from the Chinese Foreign Ministry is a brief statement which says that the Premier Li will be attending the summit. Essentially, we know that when it comes to these visits, there are a number of focus areas, whether a leader attends or not. There are domestic factors and there are geopolitical factors as well. And another can be, of course, he avoiding the US President Joe Biden as well. The American side is keen for a meeting, but the Chinese side, of course, hasn't been moving forward much. We have seen several officials, the American officials visiting Beijing in past few months as well. But of course, there is another underlining factor as well as to how the Chinese side is viewing Indian presidency of the G20 grouping. They have been in many ways undermining it. We know that various conversations that have taken place when it comes to G20 joint communique or meetings, there have been a lot of resistance from the Chinese side, and this measure by the Chinese president to skip the G20 summit here in Delhi is and will be seen as an attempt by Beijing to undermine the Indian presidency of the G20 summit.
Right, Siddhant, while you speak very much in detail about the strained relationships, even in diplomacy between the two countries, India and China, I do want to ask you a little bit about the relationships between between China and United States. We know that the two economies have been trade partners for long, and there have been a bit straining of relationship there, although attempts have been made to thaw this strained relationship with the visit of the US Commerce Secretary, the Secretary of State, and also the Treasury Secretary visiting China recently. However, Gina Raimondo, US Commerce Secretary, has come out with a statement and said that the patience of US business was wearing thin with China. How do you read this situation? Do you think possibly Xi Jinping also trying to avoid a meeting there with Joe Biden, who has already expressed his disappointment at not being able to meet him at the G20 summit?
Well, two things. First, of course, yes, Chinese president, perhaps it will be seen as not keen to meet the US president. And second, of course, not keen to meet the US president on Indian soil because of the ongoing tense relationship between India and China. But above all, it will be seen as an attempt by the Chinese side to undermine, as we have been talking about, the Indian presidency. But talking about the US-China relationship, this relationship has seen a lot of tension as well, whether it's trade, whether it's balloons as well. There have been several visits by the US officials to Beijing in last few months, but the relationship hasn't come on track. Delhi could have provided that opportunity of in-person meeting between the two leaders. We know that both the leaders had met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali, in Indonesia. That's not happening here in Delhi as the Chinese side downgrade their presence at the Delhi summit. But all in all, what can be said is when it comes to the trajectory of relationship, whether it's with Washington or or whether it's with New Delhi, Beijing's trajectory has been falling down with, of course, its own attempts, whether it's aggressive actions with India at the border, or of course coming out with new maps which saw reactions by 9 countries in the region.
Right. Siddhant, it's interesting that you mentioned that Beijing has tried to take these measures right before the G20 against Washington and New Delhi, perhaps. How do you see it positioning itself in the global south now? With India trying to position itself as the head of the global south, do you think it's a missed opportunity for China?
Well, yes, of course, in these summits, whenever there's a major country which is missing, it is also missing the opportunity to engage with other leaders. And that opportunity, of course, is naturally used by the countries who are present. I'll give you an example, the BRICS summit, where we saw the Indian and the Chinese leaders present. And they were not present only for the BRICS summit, but they were also present to engage with the global south, with the African leadership. And under the Indian presidency of the G20 summit, one focus has been the induction of African Union as a permanent invitee of the G20 grouping, and India is taking a lead on that. The Indian Prime Minister wrote to several G20 countries, and there have been a lot of support, whether it's with South Africa, whether it's with UK, France, US, and nobody will oppose this development. So India, of course, earlier this year hosted the Voice of the Global South Summit, and that summit saw a lot of outcomes. And whatever the leaders talked about there, especially when it comes to the high food, fuel and commodity prices because of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, is something that was duly noted and will feed into the summit. In fact, when it comes to the Indian presidency of the grouping, India has invited 9 countries, and many of these countries are members of the global south, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's Bangladesh as well, who is seen as a major economic power in the region. So essentially, China's loss is India's gain, and India is going to utilize that and talk more about the global south. And India is seen as a natural leader when it comes to the global south. It has the democratic credential. It has been conversing with these leaders, unlike, of course, the Chinese side, whose system is something that many countries will not be keen to adopt.
Right. Siddhant, thank you so much for joining us with those details as always.